My name is Dr. Vic Counted. I'm a psychological scientist and a university professor teaching psychology. Welcome to PsychAnalysis. If you're joining us for the first time, make sure that you subscribe to this channel. I'll be bringing to you every other week, different episodes where we try to see the world through the lens of psychology as we offer psychological case analysis of everyday people. So in this first episode of PsychAnalysis, we will take a look at Vladimir Putin as an individual, his rise to power, quest for control, some of the psychological traits that we might see in him as a person, but most especially we want to look at his dictatorship tendencies and what led to that, and if that's anything like that, of course. I want to also mention that I'm not conducting any clinical diagnosis of Mr. Putin himself, since I don't personally know him, but I can only assess his behavior from a distance and perhaps offer some insights into what might be happening in his mind as a psychological scientist. First, his background. For as long as he's been in the public eyes, Russia's president, Mr. Putin, has actually been a closed book with relatively few confirmed facts about his real thinking on foreign affairs and what motivates his policy actions. But here are some of the things that we already know about Mr. Putin. He was born in 1952 in a place currently known today as St. Petersburg, Russia. He served for 15 years in the KGB, which was a Soviet-era agency. By 1994, Putin had also become the deputy mayor in the city of St. Petersburg, and by 1998, he became the director of the Federal Security Service of Russia. And then a year later, Putin was prime minister himself, then president, and he's held this position ever since. Now, because of his political longevity, Mr. Putin has seen about 5 U.S. presidents, and 4 of them have gone, and currently he's still president, while we have Joe Biden in office. Now, during this time, there has been cooperation on trade, nuclear and ballistic missile treaties, fighting terrorism, and more. There have also been issues of human rights abuses, especially in the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and of course Syria. And there are also reports of issues about Moscow's Russia's apparent, or rather I would say Russia's tacit support for cyber hackers. And recently, which really is the focus of today's conversation, recently Mr. Putin has invaded Ukraine and framed his decision to invade the country, to invade the sovereign country, as sort of an effort to halt the West's hostile expansion that is closer to Russia's border. This was, I think, the pretext to which the invasion happened. But now to some analysis of the man Putin. First, there seems to be a general consensus in the media, especially in the West, that Putin might be a narcissist. Now, for those of you that might not know what it is, narcissism is a mental condition in which people have an inflated sense of their own importance, and people like this are said to lack empathy for others. Now, while I'm not sure why people might have reached this conclusion, photos of Russian president scuba diving, piloting a plane, behind the wheel of a race car, or demonstrating his martial act skills, only sort of contribute to this view and evoke the predictably cynical response that Putin it's a narcissist. Now, I believe that Putin's treatment of his opponents it's also suggestive of the narcissistic tendency is suggestive of a narcissistic tendency, especially since vindictiveness is quite very common among narcissists. But Mr. Putin's record as an intelligence officer might suggest otherwise, because as an intelligence officer, sort of there are certain rules that often apply in that line of work. Now, though descriptions of narcissistic personality disorder the same reminiscence of what we know of dictators, I'm not sure whether or not this trait is something that we could conclude that Putin has, given the fact that personally I don't know him as a person and can't really confirm, or I haven't assessed him clinically to really understand whether he scores high on narcissism, but it's likely that he might score above average in this particular scale, in this particular trait. But it seems that Mr. Putin not only shows a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, as he should, since he is, I guess, the number one man in his country, but he also tends to behave with a vindictiveness that is often observed in people that has a narcissistic personality disorder. Now, the second thing beyond the vindictiveness that he might have shown in his own unique way as a powerful man, the second thing that we find or see is that we've seen people refer to Mr. Putin as a psychopath. Now, for those of you that it's not aware of what this means, psychopathy, it's sort of characterized by persistent antisocial behavior, impaired empathy, and egotistical traits. While I'm not sure that that may accurately represent who Mr. Putin really is, his track record of violence and cruelty seems to prove or suggest otherwise. So it's very likely that he might score high in psychopathy, which is a dark trait, which is one of the dark triads, and likely to exhibit this in his own unique way. But his sort of behavior might perhaps kind of be an indicator that perhaps he might score higher on psychopathy. But beyond just this, I think third and most importantly, it's important that we understand what led to Mr. Putin becoming a dictator as it is today, or rather things or moments in history that sort of springboarded him or snowballed towards him becoming a dictator, because there must be a contrasting view that I must point out, which is perhaps, I believe that some also hold this view, which is the vision of Mr. Putin, who primarily wants to return the glory of the Soviet Union. Now that in itself positions him as a devoted Russian nationalist, because it is possible that beyond all the violence and cunning smartness of Mr. Putin, there is a devotion to his nation, and beyond the narcissistic or psychopathological tendencies that some might have suggested, he might be a man that is simply committed to restoring the glory, the fallen glory of his nation. But Mr. Putin seems to be a devoted nationalist, who have sort of leveraged on several springboard moments that sort of made him a dictator. I believe there are several events that kind of allowed Mr. Putin to become a dictator, and I'll try to mention just a few of those, and feel free to drop a comment, things that come to mind that I might not have covered, different events that might have contributed to him becoming a dictator. Now, I think the first might be the perceived threats that created the psychological climate that was conducive for him to take on the dictatorship model of leadership, or rather those traits might have created the psychological climate that was conducive to dictatorship. This trait might have, for example, come from the West, as they built, especially the US and NATO, as they built military bases close to Russian borders. And so there was need for Mr. Putin, to be on alert. Also, the increase in dissident groups in Russia, who might have been supported by anti-Putin strategies in the West. Also, to mention the annexation of Crimea, may have also been one of those significant events in the history of Russia, or rather in the life of Mr. Putin, that sort of inspired his nationalist desire to reestablish the former Soviet Union, because it signaled that perhaps even though that they have lost certain territory, that they can still recover them with time. And you see Mr. Putin having this same kind of thinking in his treatment of other former Soviet Union territories like Belarus, in his treatment of currently now we see Ukraine. But as we recognize the psychological climate that made it possible for Mr. Putin to become a dictator, we should also, secondly, be aware of the conditions that may have presented dictatorship as the best solution to overcome the crisis Mr. Putin was dealing with. And because without those conditions, perhaps there was no need for Mr. Putin to feel he needs to stay longer in power or be afraid of the West or annex former Soviet territories. But you find that with the increasing anti-Russia sentiment and involvement of the West in neighboring countries with borders with Russia, it might have led Mr. Putin to have adopted a dictatorship approach to sort of ensure that his vision of bringing back the former Soviet Union was alive. But also, lastly, we must also be aware of one other thing that actually led Mr. Putin to becoming a dictator that he is today, which is we must also be aware of the reforms that Mr. Putin launched to sort of ensure the resurrection of the Soviet Union, because these are all the things that sort of paved the way for him to be where he is today, to become, in the words of many, a dictator. For example, over the last 2 decades, Putin has sort of consolidated his grip on power by sort of transforming Russia's court system, Russia's media, taking control of most of the government institutions to ensure that they align with his vision of reestablishing the Soviet Union. And as a result, he sort of spent lavishly on both the military. He banned or jailed opposition politicians and journalists, and sort of cultivated support from right-wing nationalist groups. But also he also changed Russia's constitution so he can stay in power until 2036, perhaps even longer. These were all the different conditions that made it possible, that paved the way for him to become a dictator. And he even sought to crack down on opposing views online by restricting free speech on the internet. I hope that the analysis of Mr. Putin's rise to dictatorship provides you with the insight you need to make decisions for your country. But beyond just that, I think it's important because it provides us insights as to understand what's happening, so that we can make a better decision for our people and for ourselves as we watch the global scene. Thank you for watching PsychAnalysis. Make sure that you subscribe to watch more videos like this from us, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thank you. Bye.